thank you, Balu, for that introduction. But more importantly, it was such a pleasure listening to Mr. Sankar talk about Nari. It is my pleasure and privilege to be really delivering this first V. Narayanan Endowment Memorial Lecture. And what an honor it is to talk about a revered colleague. We were colleagues on the board of Hindustan Lever for many, many years. And importantly, for a lot of us of that generation, he was a role model. I can only sum him up in one way and in one phrase. He was what I call a typical officer and gentleman. That's what Nari was, an officer and a gentleman. And to my mind, they don't make them like that anymore. And the other thing that I always, whenever I think of Nari, I think of the kind of followership that a leader has. That decides the kind of leader you are. And it is great to see this illustrious alumni of Ponds. I saw a lot of the mug shots of the who's who of Indian industry. And they're all people who started with Nari and a part of his, as Balu described, the NWKs, Nari's Biscuits. So it's a great pleasure for me to be really here on this momentous occasion. Balu and others from MMA told me to talk on leadership in turbulent times. And I thought the best way to do it is to really do it in two parts. Let me first talk about the context, because that's important. The context of the world we live in, the context of the world in which we do business. And then let me share with you lessons that I have learned through my career, and importantly also through watching others who have admired in terms of the way they have led businesses. And what I've done is tried to distill 8 lessons in leadership during turbulent times. Why 8? Well, you can always add or remove from there because some of them may be relevant, some of them you may find irrelevant, but that's not important. So let's talk a little bit about the context in which we operate in, or we live in, the world that we live in. And I think it's actually best described by what Lenin said during the Russian Revolution in 1917. He said, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And that's the world that we live in. We live in a world, I mean, it's a cliche, but we live in a world where change is the only constant. And the only predictability that we have is that it's going to be unpredictable. And the fact of the matter is that this was the state of the world well before the current COVID-19 pandemic hit us. In fact, the world was always described as what they call the VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that's the world that we were operating in. And I think in order for us to decide how we are going to manage and lead businesses, we really need to go back to what were some of the mega trends before the world hit the pause button with the COVID crisis. Because I don't think a lot has changed. It's just that we are on a pause button at the moment. And I think if you look at some of the trends, the first big one was the rising inequality in the world. And we know that that's become a really big issue across the geographies in the world. The second was a resource-stressed environment in which we operate. You know, there is a huge amount of concern whether we are being responsible in the way we manage our natural resources and we look after our environment. The third, which I think is unfortunate but true, is the return to tribalism and protectionism. People are retreating back into their own communities, their own regions, their own geographies. And COVID pandemic has not kind of helped in that. And then, of course, there is this double-edged sort of weapon called technology, which on the one hand is making our life that much easier, but on the other is creating the kind of disruptions in the way we work and the way business gets conducted that we just have to recognize that we have to learn to manage the impact of what technology is going to do to employment and so many other things. And finally, for me, I think the most important thing is that the role of business is changing in the current context. There are expectations from business that did not exist before. This is not about managing shareholder value. It's about managing stakeholders. It's about playing a positive role in society in which we operate. So that's the context. And as we kind of now enter what has been a very challenging situation, which is the current pandemic, I think there are really two things that people are obsessed by, and quite rightly. The first is business continuity. How do we make sure that we get out of this crisis, okay, and don't become a kind of victim to it? And the second, of course, there is a lot of discussion around the timing and the shape of the recovery that's going to take place. Okay, people are talking about V-shaped recoveries, U-shaped recoveries, K-shaped recoveries. So here is my two bits of sort of, one is a solace, and the other, I think, is an important point that we need to take into account. The comforting factor of this whole thing is, and I'm now going to quote something from our ancient scriptures, the Upanishads, which talked, the Sanskrit saying, which talked about neti, neti, neti. This is not it, this is not it, this is not it. Nothing is permanent in life, okay? And I think that, to my mind, is the biggest comfort I can give to all of us who are facing this pandemic and this crisis. This will not last. Good things don't last, bad things don't last. And that is the turbulent times that we live in. The second bit is that instead of being obsessed by the timing and the shape of the recovery, the real question we should be asking ourselves is, what is going to remain the same when we come out of this crisis, and what is going to change? And I think this has been best described by David Hollis, who, by the way, is a Disney veteran and now a renowned coach and writer. And he says, in the rush to return to normal, use this time, which is the pandemic, to consider which parts of normal are worth rushing into. Okay? And I think, to my mind, that is important. So the lessons that I will share with you are some lessons that I think have remained the same, whether it was pre-COVID or it is post-COVID. And some of them have been actually tempered by what I have seen during the pandemic and the crisis that we are going through currently. So let me briefly talk about these 8 lessons. So hang on, put on your seatbelts. We're going to go through 8 lessons. The first lesson, which I have learned through my career, is no growth, no future. Lesson number 1. Okay, and then a wise person had said, growth solves most problems. More growth solves the rest. Okay, and to my mind, a business has to continuously focus on growth, irrespective of the times you go through, because growth at the end is business as usual. And to my mind, any business that takes his eye off the growth ball may not have a future. But there are dimensions to growth. There is, of course, growth in terms of expanding your business. But at the same time, while it is business as usual on growth, it always has to be business unusual on costs and profitability. Because if you don't invest, you don't grow. You cannot invest unless you can generate a surplus. You cannot generate a surplus unless you are prepared for every eventuality. And in a volatile world, it is so important that while you continue to ask yourself, how do you want to grow? You also have to ask yourself, how do you prepare yourself for the worst case scenario? So business as usual on growth, business unusual on costs and profitability. That is important. Now, here's the interesting thing. I believe that growth and costs, or growth and profit, are part of the same coin. They're two sides of the same coin. And both require one very important ingredient, and that is innovation. That, people often think of innovation as producing some really jazzed up, sexy products and services. But Clayton Christensen, who's the guru of innovation and teaches at the Harvard Business School, actually gave perhaps what I think is the best definition of innovation. He says innovation is doing things differently that create value. That's the definition of innovation. Doing things differently that create value. In any organization, there are people who are working on the front end. There are people who are working on actually product innovation. And there are people who are supporting this, whether it is functional support and so on and so forth. You need in any organizations poets and farmers. You need people who are thinking about the future. You also need people who are doing things today, but doing things differently. So my message, lesson number one is no growth, no future, but growth is about, it's a multidimensional thing. It's about growing and expanding your business, but also generating a surplus irrespective of the scenarios. Let me talk about lesson number 2. And by the way, this is in no particular order of importance. Lesson number 2 is stay relevant to all stakeholders. That's lesson number 2. So let me start by saying growth is important, but the most important dimension of growth is responsible growth. This is even more important. The role of business, like I said, is changing. And you have to recognize that business has to be part of the solution to the world, to the communities that we serve. And the most important advice I can give you is hear the voice of your customers, hear the voice of your communities, hear the voice of your employees all the time. You lose touch with that voice, you don't have your ear to the ground, you will find yourself out of business. So that's lesson number 2. Let me talk about lesson number 3. Lesson number 3 is execution is strategy, and strategy is execution. People often treat execution as a side act and treat strategy as a more important aspect of business. I'm sorry. If you don't know how to do a strategy, ask a consultant, they'll help you. The critical thing is not strategy. Ultimately, strategy is a very simple thing. Strategy is about making choices. That's all strategy is. You can put it into 100 pages or a presentation, or you can simply ask yourself, what are the choices that a business is making? But the critical aspect is execution. And here I'm reminded of a wonderful Hindi saying, which says, karne se hota hai. Okay, it happens when you do. Simple. Nothing happens if you don't do. I know it's a tautology, but karne se hota hai. If you do, it happens. And I think often we forget, as we become leaders, that just having the big picture is not important. You must have the ability to paint a big picture, but you also must have the ability to spot the pixels. So pixels and picture is both important if you want to be successful in today's context. Let me come to lesson number 4. And I know this will be a little controversial. I think the medium term is dead. This is now all about the short term, which is managing the here and now, and it is about managing the long term, which is to create a destination for yourself, a sense of purpose in terms of where you want to go. Why is short and long term important and not medium term? In a world that is so turbulent and so uncertain, managing the here and now, what I call business continuity, is mission critical. But at the same time, when you're in choppy waters and you're going through a huge amount of turbulence, you have to navigate this. Don't forget and don't lose sight of your destination, because then you could land up in the place you don't want to land up. So the here and now is important. The long-term destination is important. And the rest you have to manage dynamically. This idea of managing for the medium term frankly, yes, you can put together plans of three-year plans and all that. As long as you are rolling them every quarter, every year, you're probably is not going to be very much use beyond the pieces of paper that you've written it on. That brings me to the fifth lesson. And this, to my mind, is really important. Every company is now a technology company. You are either a creator of technology, an enabler of technology, or a user of technology. Every company. There are no exceptions. And the sooner we understand that, the better it is. Tesla is not a car. It's software on wheels. That's what Tesla is. But Tesla is not the only example in the world. If you look at even more conventional businesses, you have to recognize that unless you use digitization and technology, you will never be able to make the right kind of decisions. Data is the most important thing that a business has. And it is really critical that every business embraces technology, either, like I said, as an enabler or even as a creator or user of technology. And that brings me to lesson number 6. So hang in, we are getting there. Lesson number 6 is the importance of what I call a horizontal culture in an organization. And what do I mean by that? I'm reminded of Mark Twain, who once said, "Don't let school get in the way of education." And if I can paraphrase that, don't let organization structures get in the way of growth. I think we make ourselves too complex as organizations. Horizontal culture or horizontal organizations are all about organizing for outcomes and organizing for agility. Okay? This idea of hierarchical organizations is, I think, so outdated. You do not need interfaces in organization. You do not need coordinators. Coordinators are required when you are trying to broker peace between verticals and silos. You do not need silos. And here I'm reminded of one of my dear colleagues who unfortunately passed away, Mr. A.C. Chakravarti. Mr. A.C. Chakravarti used to be the general factory manager of Garden Reach factory many, many years ago, where Garden Reach was one of our, not one, the most important factory that we had. And I used to be a branch manager in Calcutta. And we were having a drink once, and Mr. Chakravarti was a tough taskmaster. Somehow, sort of decided that evening that he needs to teach me a lesson or two, and says, "Harish, I think you're going to go far in this organization, and I want to just tell you one thing. The most important people in the organization are only two sets of people. One who makes soap and the others who sell soap. Everyone else is an overhead or an indirect." Now, that was A.C. Das' simple way of giving what I think is a very complex but a very right message. Organizations basically need to ask themselves, where do we deploy our people? Do we deploy it on the front end where we are meeting our customers, or do we deploy it at the back end, which is enabling either making profit or making a sale? And it's interesting that when I became the CEO of Unilever, I kept this very important lesson in mind. No matter which country I went to, I asked one question. Tell me what percentage of your resources are deployed in the front end and how much is deployed at the back end. And the point I'm making is the more interfaces you create, the more difficult it becomes to take decisions, and you lose agility. Some of you may have traveled to the UK, and in the London Metro, every time you land up on a station, they say, "Mind the gap." Okay, and the gap is between the train and the station. In organizations, those interfaces, the gaps, are in between the matrices. They are the ones who are kind of think they're going to broker between the verticals, between different parts of the organization. You don't need that. So that was my lesson number 6, horizontal culture. Organize around outcomes and organize around agility. Lesson number 7, and I think this has been absolutely precipitated by the COVID crisis. Caring is a competitive advantage. You have to create a caring organization. And that I have 2 dimensions of caring. The first dimension is that you have to build people. You have to constantly renew their license to operate, or to put it simply in organizational terms, you have to make sure that you are always upskilling and creating the right capabilities in the organization. That's important. Why is that important? I can tell you, I was brought up in Hindustan Lever as a marketeer. You know, Hindustan Lever is pretty well known for its marketing. But I have no license to operate as a marketeer today, because where people buy, what people watch is all changed. Unless I am tech savvy, unless I know how influencers work, how social media works, I can't be successful. So, it's like saying, if you train a pilot to be a 737 pilot, they can fly Dreamliners. No, they can't. You have to constantly upgrade. So this idea of continuous learning and upgrading is so important. That's called caring for people, building people. And the second bit is care for your people in a crisis. A lot of companies distinguished themselves during the COVID crisis by ensuring that they kept their employees above all else. And to my mind, you don't get a second chance to make the first impression. Okay? You don't get the second chance. This crisis is an opportunity to demonstrate to your people that you truly care. So for me, lesson number 7 is caring is a competitive advantage. And finally, let me come to what I think is probably for all of you listening around, an important aspect, which is leadership. And my eighth point lesson is leadership matters. And much has been written about leadership. What is the role of leaders? What is the role of a CEO? What's the role of a unit head? What do you do? And I really put it down to 2 things. The role of a leader is to give energy to the organization. And number 2 is to manage the corporate reputation. That's the role of a leader. Okay? And I like to simplify it so that you can either agree with it or disagree with it, add to it or not add to it. What do I mean by giving energy? You give energy in an organization by creating a purpose which is larger than the business that you do. Some people call it vision, some call it purpose. But you have to create a purpose-led organization. It's really important. People don't work for you because we sell a bar of soap, or Balu was selling talcum powder and thermometers. People work for you because there was a larger sense of purpose. And that is really important. The second bit in terms of unleashing energy is, and you will recognize this, there are some leaders who will walk into that room and you feel energized. You want to do anything for them. And there are some leaders who suck energy out of you. You walk into the room and you come out thinking that you are useless. You cannot solve any problem. So be the leader that can give energy. Be purpose-led, create a larger purpose for the business. And number 2, when you're interacting with your team, give energy. Don't take away energy. And the second bit, which I think is very, very important, particularly in today's connected world, is manage your corporate reputation. It is so important to set some non-negotiables. All of us think our job is to tell people what to do. I believe a lot of my job in senior positions was to tell people what not to do. Non-negotiables. There are things you have to walk away from. And it is really important that as you go higher and higher in the organization, you recognize that being purpose-led and values-driven is an absolutely critical part of leadership. In today's context, reputations take years and decades to build. People still talk fondly about bonds, but it took years of leadership, like people like Nari, etc., who worked on it, and Balu and others. But with a click of a mouse, your reputation can be destroyed if you do something that doesn't agree with the society in which you operate. So those were my 8 lessons to you. And I think if I can just summarize it, in conclusion, what I'm really trying to say is that successful organizations of the future will consistently manage the paradox of the short and long term. They will always manage for growth, but profit and responsible growth is an important part of that growth metric. Shareholders are very important, but stakeholders are even more important. Being purpose-led and values-driven is mission critical. But the best way I can summarize this is to really kind of paraphrase or turn something that Jim Collins, the guru of management, actually made very popular. He wrote a bestseller called From Good to Great. It was Jim Collins' book about how do companies go from being good to great. With all due apologies to Jim Collins, I would say the companies of the future will go from being great to good, not good to great. Companies of the future will produce great financial results and great performance, but they will also be good companies, good for the societies that they serve. And that brings me finally to Nari. Nari actually epitomizes exactly that. Here is a leader that produced great business results, but above all, he was a good human being. And that's what I mean. If you want to be a great leader, be an officer and a gentleman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harish. That was a brilliant concept, brilliantly delivered, as only you can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Since we got about 5 minutes there, if you would like to take some questions, I got a couple of questions from the social media portal. Harish, can I put at least 2-3 questions you would like to take?
Of course, of course.
Here is a question from Mr. Raghu from Mumbai. He's watching, he's a YouTube, the questions come from YouTube. What he wants to know, in your opinion, what leaders in general have learned in the last 15 months during the pandemic? One important lesson what many leaders have learned.
I think that was the whole idea of this talk. I think if you ask me, the 2 things is caring is a competitive advantage. Okay, I think that is so important, which we've learned. And number 2, what really matters at the end of the day is to manage the paradox or what I call the and agenda. You have to manage the short term, and you need to constantly ask yourself how you're going to manage the long term. Manage the crisis, the pandemic, but at the same time, make sure you're thinking beyond the pandemic. And this ability of an organization to be schizophrenic, to look today and to look tomorrow, is important. So I would pick these 2 as critical.
Thank you. Here's a question from Mr. Babu, is from Bangalore. What he wants to know is leadership during turbulent time is different than the leadership during the normal time? How a leader should realign himself, if required, during the turbulent times when he is faced with so much of tough situations?
So, like I said in the beginning, life was always turbulent. I mean, you know, I use that cliche, the only constant is change, and the only consistency is inconsistency. The rate of change is so high, and it was happening pre-COVID, it's going to happen post-COVID. And therefore, businesses have to learn to be more agile. Businesses have to learn to change, like I said, to sort of turn around on a dime, to be able to really manage their businesses more dynamically. But equally, when the world is so fragile, you need to have a clarity on your destination. If you don't have it, you lurch from one opportunity to another, from one crisis to another. What are you all about? Why are you here? Why are you doing business? These are such important questions that you've got to give people when things are collapsing or changing all the time, not collapsing, but changing all the time. So I would say that that is probably one of the most important things that you have to keep in mind.
Here's a question from Mr. Francis from Chennai. He says, how would you advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion with colleagues who don't understand its importance many a times?
Sorry, the question is that they don't understand the importance of inequity and, sorry, what was the question?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Well, if they don't understand it, then I'm afraid they don't have a future. This is a non-negotiable. I mean, how can you ignore what's going on around you? So you talk about inequity. I mean, you know, unless, see, you cannot, one of our erstwhile chairman of Unilever used to say, you cannot have a thriving business in a sick society. You cannot say, I'm going to prosper while the world around me does not prosper. How can that happen? So I think that's absolutely not on. The second bit about, I want to talk a little bit about diversity because I did talk about it. Often you have to remember one thing, that diversity is Mr. Shankar, you have to put yourself on mute.
Sorry.
Diversity is not good to do. Diversity is essential because when you look for talent, how can you ignore 50% of the world? How can you say, I'm not, you know, I'm going to only look for diversity. You know, I can't help it. We've only got males in our organization. 50% of the world's population is female. A lot of our folks come from different and diverse backgrounds. They are all talented people. So if you want to expand your talent pool or the pond in which you fish, no pun intended, you have to embrace diversity. So I'm sorry if you don't believe in it, you're not going to have much of a future, I can tell you, as a leader. Full stop.
Thank you, sir. Very, very appropriate. Here's a question from Mr. Gopal from Hyderabad. What do you want to know? Which change do you consider to be the most significant one that you brought about in your organization when you are, especially in Sun Unilever?
You know, people often ask me this, and I always say, if I can think of one or two things that I did, it will not do justice to the organization. And I say this with all humility, that in everything that I achieved and everything that I did which was successful, I cannot say that I was responsible for it. All I know is quite a few good things happened because fortunately I did not stop it from happening. Or alternatively, several good things happened because I was part of a great team that made it possible. And honestly, business is not about, I'm a professional manager. I was not a founder of this business. I didn't start the business, okay? And therefore, I can't even claim that Unilever rose to heights because I founded the business. As a professional manager, my job, if I have to take one thing, I always believed that my job was to build leaders that were bigger than me, okay? And today I can proudly say that there are so many people who worked with me in my teams who are doing things that are bigger than me. And that's the whole idea. And I must tell you, there used to be this, in my last role as a CEO of Unilever, I used to run what was called the Global Market Executive. So all the presidents and group presidents of our different geographies used to sit in that. And I used to always tell them, my job is not to give you answers, because at the end of the day, you know more about your business than I do. And I can tell you, there are at least 3 or 4 of you here in this room who can do this job, my job, better than I can. But I'm not going to tell you who that person is or who those 4 people are. But all I can say is, at the end of the day, I can ask questions, but I can't give you solutions. And as you go higher and higher in the organization, it is important to understand that it is the questions you ask, not the answers you give. And this is the teams you build and not what you achieve. So long answer to your short question.